no matter how deeply invested you are in this hard science worldview, you are capable of waking up to direct and powerful internal contact with spirit.
Keep watching to learn more.
Book 3 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu. You can now download all 8 copies of the New Thinking Aloud magazine for free, or order beautiful printed copies. Go to newthinkingaloud.org.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we will be exploring the presence of spirits in the inner life of the mind. My guests, and I have 3 guests today, are Chelsea Odhner, Robert Falconer, and Jonathan Rose, who are the co-authors of a new book published by the Swedenborg Foundation titled Opening the Inner World. Chelsea Rose Odhner is Vice President of Publishing for the Swedenborg Foundation and is also a trained internal family systems practitioner and a body worker. Robert Falconer, who has been a guest several times on New Thinking Aloud, is a pioneering therapist and international educator in internal family systems therapy. He is co-author of Many Minds, Oneself, co-written with IFS founder Richard Schwartz. Falconer's book, The Others Within Us, is a groundbreaking work which emphasizes porosity of the mind to external spiritual influences as a key component to healing. And Jonathan Rose, who has also been on New Thinking Aloud previously, is series editor of the New Century edition of Swedenborg's theological works. He is also author of The Message of Love Behind the 10 Commandments and Swedenborg's Garden of Theology. And now I'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, Jonathan, Robert, and Chelsea. It is a pleasure to be with each of you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So happy to be here.
Great to be here with you.
Let's start with you, Chelsea, because you're the person who really, I think, is central to this collaboration in the sense that you bridge both of these two worlds, the world of internal family systems therapy and the world of Swedenborgian theology.
Just to speak a little bit to the genesis of this book. So I'm the Vice President of Publishing at the Swedenborg Foundation, but have worked in varying capacities at the Swedenborg Foundation for just over 10 years now. And beyond that, have had a lifetime interest and study in Swedenborg, particularly with an interest toward practice and like contemplative engagement with what Swedenborg writes about. I have studied yoga and meditation, different kinds. And it was really through my own healing journey that I found internal family systems. And when I did, I just was so struck with that this therapeutic model seemed so intuitive to me from my Swedenborg background. So not only, I think internal family systems is a very intuitive thing for a lot of people to pick up because it just resonates with the way our inner psyches work. It's very aligned there. But then there seemed to be this added layer, this advantage I felt like I had because of how I had the Swedenborg worldview and framework loaded in my mind. And I just wondered, who knows about Swedenborg in the internal family systems world? And I just had this question open in myself for a number of years as I'm personally tracking and studying between what Swedenborg says about our spirits and what IFS says about parts and self and relationships there. And it was actually when Bob came out with his book, The Others Within Us, that I watched a demo and an interview with Bob about the book. And based on that demo, I just thought, this guy must have heard of Swedenborg. I was like, there's no way. Or if he hasn't, I have to know, and I have to connect with him about Swedenborg. So I reached out to Bob, and he was graciously willing to meet with me. And it was just total delight. Turns out he had studied Swedenborg some, but was very eager to engage more in depth with the Swedenborg world coming from his background with IFS. And I very early proposed the idea of, I have wanted to write a book on internal family systems and Swedenborg. Like, these two worlds need to meet. And would he be willing to create a book together with me? And Bob's idea was to have it be through conversation. Let's talk about Swedenborg and IFS together. And when he seeded that idea with me, I thought, you know what, I'd love to bring in Jonathan Rose, Swedenborg translator, longtime scholar and Swedenborg translator of Swedenborg's writings, who is not familiar with the internal family systems model, and to bring these two worlds together through these recorded conversations, Bob and Jonathan having never met each other yet. So it would really be a fresh coming together. And during this time in my own journey, I also was able to do a level 1 IFS training. So I'm now also a level 1 trained IFS practitioner and coach and a licensed massage therapist, body worker. So I bring all of that to my experience of Swedenborg and IFS. And it was just total delight to get to produce this book together with Bob and Jonathan.
Well, Robert, we've talked before more than once, and I know from our previous conversations that you were influenced by a fellow I actually used to know, Wilson Van Dusen, a psychotherapist who was deeply influenced by Swedenborg. I think Van Dusen wrote before IFS was even founded, I believe, but he had a big influence on you back then.
Yeah, we were in correspondence for quite a while. And then one of his primary students, the Reverend Rachel Rivers, who's a Swedenborgian minister, and we would do weekly or bi-weekly sessions for, I think it's like 8 or 10 years now. And now we have a group with another gentleman, the three of us meet. So I do, by the standards of Jonathan and Chelsea, I'm a beginner, but by most people's standards, I'm pretty deeply immersed in this world. I want to say this, and perhaps I shouldn't, but that's what I'm here for, say the stuff. I find reading Swedenborg directly is very difficult, very challenging. And so I've relied a lot on secondary sources and talking to people like Rachel and Van Dusen and Jerry Marzinski, another psychotherapist who's used Swedenborg.
Jonathan, you are certainly an expert on Swedenborg, and the truth is, it is difficult to get through. Among other reasons, his writings are encyclopedic. I mean, it would take any normal person years to just read everything.
It's true. He published 3.5 million Latin words that turn into 5 million words in English. And although I've been head of this New Century Edition project to translate his works into more accessible English, it's not just the sheer volume, although that is a big problem, but also there are interwoven concepts that he puts forward. And it's sort of like, in order to understand this, you have to understand that, but also this, but also that. And if you're missing a piece, you're not really getting what he's saying. And so it does take, it's certainly taken me a long time to feel that I have some sort of grasp of what he's saying. these conversations with Chelsea and Bob were so delightful. I wasn't sure at first why I would, what I had to add to the conversation, because Bob's done therapy and trained probably thousands of people in IFS and really been doing this work. But I realized as I reflected on it before our first conversation that actually I knew Van Dusen personally. I'd studied family systems theory, which was sort of an antecedent, I think, to internal family systems theory, and just in sort of a lay way, and have always been interested in the mind, as Swedenborg was too. What really works? I've had quite a bit of therapy in my life, and some of it felt more effective than others, and so I've been very interested in how you evolve a practice that is true enough to the human mind that it really works and helps people move forward. And it seems like IFS really does have something very, very special. It's a spiritual modality of healing the mind and heart.
Well, at this point, I know that there are going to be viewers who are scratching their heads because they have no background on either Swedenborg or IFS. So what I will do for the benefit of those viewers, in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, I'm going to link to some of our earlier interviews, one with Robert, in which he talks more deeply about IFS, and we have an interview with Jonathan as well, talking about Swedenborg. So I'm going to link to those for those viewers who have equipment that can capture that link, like most computers will do. Smartphones may or may not. And you'll have access to those videos if you like. But for the benefit of our viewers, let's start by talking about Swedenborg a little bit as well. I know both Jonathan, you and Chelsea came from families that were Swedenborgian. So you were introduced as children. And I think it's very ironic that on the one hand, Swedenborg has had an enormous influence over the whole Western esoteric tradition since his lifetime in the 18th century. On the other hand, even though there is the Swedenborgian Church, I understand it has only 15,000 members, which makes it pretty small compared to practically every other religion. So I used to feel like, being Jewish, we were really in a minority, but Judaism is very mainstream compared to the Swedenborg's faith. Although I have to say, I attended a wedding service in the Swedenborg Church in San Francisco, and as far as I can tell, the church itself, the edifice, and the service were beautiful.
Maybe I'll give a little background on Swedenborg, and it's absolutely true. I just want to underscore what you said, that there is sort of a puzzle with the fact that once you dig down, you see that all these movements and developments in the last couple of hundred years have owe something to Swedenborg. There's certainly been scholars that have traced this influence, and yet not a household name. And as you say, the church organizations are really almost infinitesimally small. So, but let me give you a little background on Swedenborg. He was born in 1688, died in 1772. He was a Swedish nobleman. His name, Swedenborg, actually has nothing to do with our English word Sweden. It just happens to be a coincidence that he's got the name of his country right in his name. But he was when he was younger, he was very interested in science, anatomy. He was a very bright young man, and investigating everything, wanted to learn everything, toured around Europe and met some of the astronomers and other leading thinkers of his time, and had some very interesting conversations with King Charles XII, where they were developing certain projects before Charles met an untimely death. So he was an up-and-comer, a talented person. And some scholars have argued that his main thing that he was always interested in, even though now he's working in mineralogy, now he's interested in astronomy or anatomy and so on, he always had an interest in the human mind and psychology. This was pre-Freud, pre-Jung, obviously. Was there even such a thing back then? The term psychology was around, but it meant more the study of the soul, which is what's original meaning. And there's a draft that is lost, but we know the title of it because he wrote about it in a letter to his brother-in-law, Method of Analyzing Feelings, in his 20s. And this is not something, now that sounds very ordinary now, not ordinary in the 18th century, not what people were thinking about in the Enlightenment and so on. So in his 50s, he had a spiritual awakening, kind of a crisis in his career and in what he was working on. It wasn't really getting where he wanted to go. He'd gotten quite famous and well known. The newspaper would report his movements around Europe and so on. Just Swedenborg's leaving for Amsterdam, just as if that in itself was news. But then he had this spiritual breakthrough where he felt that he saw Jesus, and the veil became very thin for him. It first started in his dreams, and later in his daily waking life, he could communicate with people who had passed on, including his own relatives and other people he knew who had died, and kind of took his scientific clipboard into the other world, if you wish, and was studying how things work up there and writing and publishing down here of what he was finding, and wrote these very many books and left these for people. So that's kind of a brief thumbnail of Swedenborg.
Oh, I was just going to add that you were mentioning the different churches, and at the Swedenborg Foundation, we also run the Off the Left Eye YouTube channel that I've been a part of and was involved in the production and appeared on it for many years. And it seems like through that, we have such an enormous reach now, global and universal reach in terms of people engaging with Swedenborg's spiritual teachings, but not within a specific church or religious framework, but very much feeding the spiritual but not religious movement, if you will, if you can call it a movement, but that sort of phenomenon that we see so much nowadays. And while also finding people that come from all different faiths and yet find value in Swedenborg's teachings and incorporate them or reflect on how it mirrors certain teachings of theirs. And what Swedenborg, he was coming from this Swedish Lutheran background, and yet he was having these direct experiences of the spiritual world and then bringing the mind of a scientist to them, and then just cataloging everything he could and writing it all down. And so I find his books just have such an appeal to so many different people. But like you say, like Bob and Jeff, you've both said it, they can be tricky to get into. So I feel like that's been a real joy through Off the Left Eye to go super deep into Swedenborg's teachings and pull out even just an hour-long broadcast or an hour and a half or even 30-minute broadcast that kind of encapsulates particular ideas from Swedenborg.
We will link to Off the Left Eye in the description of this video, as well as to websites for each of you. When I think of the relationship between Swedenborg's work and psychotherapy, what comes to mind for me is the case of Henry James Sr., the father of William James, who experienced a spiritual crisis. And as I recall at the time, he was in England and he was very bereft and didn't know what to do when he encountered a Swedenborgian practitioner who basically set him on a path that he remained on the rest of his life, that somehow for him the connection with the teachings of Swedenborg resolved this terrible crisis he was experiencing. I wonder if any of you are familiar with the details of that.
I'm just aware of it, that he had a special, what would you call it, a trunk made that would just fit his entire set of Swedenborg's works and be able to carry that around Europe, because he did a lot of traveling with his sons, and his son William, of course, was so influential. Bob could speak much more to.
The father of American psychology.
That's right.
Not to mention religious studies and pragmatic philosophy, one of my heroes.
Even though, from what I understand, my wife wrote her dissertation on Henry James, the author, and William and Henry were both a little embarrassed by their father's intense Swedenborgianism, I think. But I still think it sort of leaked into their mindset in a way.
When you rebel against your father, at the same time you're incorporating into your psyche the very thing you're rebelling against. And William James, I believe, recognized that, because after his father's death, he edited some of his father's writings and wrote about how influential his father's Swedenborgian teachings really were on his own thinking.
I just think of Helen Keller and her work, Light in My Darkness, about the enormous influence of Swedenborg in her spiritual path. And I guess it was perhaps Wilson Van Dusen who writes in the introduction to The Presence of Other Worlds that his grandmother gifted him these very small red bound books, this collection, and just said, "This is everything you need to know." And she gave him these books, and they are actually what's called a Swedenborg library that was produced by Benjamin Barrett in the late 19th century, that is just a little topical index collection, a digest of Swedenborg on a number of different topics put out in these 12 cute volumes. And so again, there's Wilson Van Dusen, who just remembered being given these red books and then forgot about it, but then found his way back to understanding, oh, that's who this was. And that was like what his grandmother had bestowed on him.
Well, the reason I brought up Henry James Sr., the father of the great novelist Henry James Jr., was that he went through this crisis. He met the Swedenborgian practitioner in England who identified that crisis right away. She had a name for it that I now forget, but she seemed to say, this is what you're going through. It's described very precisely in Swedenborg's writings, and here is what you need to do about it. And it worked. It made me imagine that Swedenborg himself must have suffered a similar crisis that he had to address.
Just to even bridge that into the IFS and Swedenborg connection that we explore in our book, I don't know if this is the word, but the word regeneration comes to mind from Swedenborg's standpoint, because it's this idea of a process of growth and spiritual development that we're all on from our birth through the end of our life and into our spiritual lives in the spiritual world. And it's being guided by divine providence. There's sort of these necessary spiritual crises we have to go through, devastation, Swedenborg calls it sometime, that then are followed by consolation, this sort of cycle of our spiritual growth that naturally involves intense experiences that sort of propel the experience forward. And I see that as one of those helpful sort of frameworks that you can apply to IFS, because when you're doing internal family systems work, and these parts that we find in us have burdens, and the experience of these burdens are really difficult, and even our experiences of trauma and or legacy burdens that IFS talks about, that regeneration is that there's this larger design that helps us heal from all of that. That's this larger context that holds that whole experience, so that it's not just for right now, or trying to relieve our suffering or avoid pain or something. Like, there's a larger spiritual purpose and meaning to this, to the spiritual healing journeys that we're on.
I gather from your book that one of the similarities between IFS, internal family systems therapy, and Swedenborg's philosophy is the idea that things that appear to be evil may not really be evil at all. That Swedenborg seemed to suggest that even the demonic has a positive role in our life. And I'm pretty sure from my conversations with you, Robert, that that's your attitude as well towards things that other traditions and other individuals might say are strictly evil and they want to have no part of.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I want to jump back a little bit and give an outsider's view of the Swedenborg world. I'm nowhere near the scholar, but when I studied Swedenborg's life, to me, he was probably the foremost scientist of his day. I mean, he was the director of copper mining, and smelting, very technical, hands-on stuff for the King of Sweden. And then he had this crisis experience and spent the next, 27, 30 years of his life creating what I sort of consider a geography of the inner world. And it's almost never prescriptive. It's not like this moral thing. You better blah, 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 blah. It's more like, well, this is here and this is here and this is here. And, so that's very, very different and wonderful. And one of the things that I got most powerfully from Swedenborg is a quickening. A sense that no matter how deeply invested you are in this hard science worldview, you are capable of waking up to direct and powerful internal contact with spirit. I think that's an immensely important message right now, and it's very meaningful to me. I'm publishing another book in a couple months called Spirit Speaks, which is records of my own contact with spirit. And in part, doing this book with you guys, you're partly responsible for this. Gave me the courage to put this out there, because I think it really compromised Swedenborg's reputation and career when he started. He published some of this stuff anonymously, and so it wasn't easy for him to make this shift, and it's not easy today. One other thing I want to say that I find very ironic about the acceptance of Swedenborg when I talk about him to IFS people, the thing that seems most convincing to IFS people is that D.T. Suzuki, the great Japanese Zen Buddhist, wrote a book about Swedenborg called Swedenborg, the Buddha of the North. And that gets, you have to go all the way to the East to get people back interested in Western spirituality. Yeah, I agree that our gross categories of good and evil don't fit for Swedenborg, and they don't fit for me, and I don't think they fit for IFS. IFS says very strongly there are no bad parts of us. Even the suicidal parts of us and the parts of us that are drinking, they're not bad. They're just carrying really, really heavy burdens. And we want to welcome them home and help them shed those burdens, not amputate them or punish them or bulldoze them or all that nasty old school stuff.
Well, one of the distinctions that you make, Robert, is that the parts that are spoken of in IFS are generally considered to be internal to each person, fragments of the psyche that get split off or divided. So you would say each of us is really a community of different voices. However, then you say some of those voices in rare instances, are really external to the psyche. And those are different. And I gather that Swedenborg must also make a similar distinction. Is that correct?
Yes, definitely. Yeah, he, in addition to our parts being, Swedenborg talks about the different levels of our spirit, our inner self and our outer self, and there seems to be a multiplicity even to our outer self. Jonathan and I were discussing, even if what Swedenborg calls a thought is a part, according to Swedenborg, there's different ways, but he talks about parts making up what we are, that our inner system is like a family, a household, but then that we also have associate spirits. And that was one of the interesting things to discuss in this book, was that associate spirits are this necessary, you can think of all the bacteria that lives all over your skin and inside of your body. Like, you need it to live, and you don't know it's even there, and it's a part of you, but it's hard to know where one ends and the next begins, but that's our associate spirits. But then you can have the experience of what Bob describes in his book, and I guess in IFS it's called unattached burdens, is like interactions with spirits that are these external conscious entities that are then somehow connected to our system for a reason. There's some, you can understand why it's there. And anyway, then there's ways to clean up your connections and shift your attachments in the spiritual world from the more negative ones to more positive ones, and spiritual communities that way. But I want to hear, Jonathan, any additional thoughts that you have to that.
Yeah, it's so striking to put Swedenborg and IFS together, because IFS just came to this wisdom through a very pragmatic course, in the sense of trying to help people and work with them for their healing, and really listen to them about what they say is going on with them. And then Swedenborg is coming also from an experiential angle, but when we read what he says, it can turn into sort of a theory in our head. But putting that experience-based theory together with this experience of therapy, and one of the points of contact is that Swedenborg says that if you could, he says that groups of people function like a single individual. And you can sort of see that the way that different countries will, they almost act like they're just one thing, and one representative can speak for this entire, tens of millions of people in some interaction. But also, if you go down within a given individual into their thoughts and feelings that they have, those too are in a complete human form, he says. They have their own memories, they have their own existence. And this is such a striking thing, because that's very much what IFS found too. And so it really is hard to tell. I love that phrase. I don't know if it's your phrase, Bob, but that porosity of mind is such a great expression, because that's certainly the way Swedenborg says it. He can't even tell sometimes whether he's thinking what the angels are saying or whether they're talking about what he's thinking. It's hard to even tell who's doing what to whom. But then you do get some, he speaks about an internal possession. He says that there was external possession in the time of the New Testament, where people are being thrown into the fire, or they're, convulsed and so on. He says that a lot of that was taken care of at that time, but that there's a thing called internal possession now that's much more frequent than people realize. And that speaks to Bob's book about the others within us, that your parts, no bad parts, they're burdened, but they're there to help you. But then you can get these other characters in there who just wish your harm, and they're not. And still, even then, Swedenborg would say they're still allowed. There is a control over the system, a kind of divine hand on it. That's there. There's something that you can benefit from that. It's not just senseless. They didn't just sort of walk in and take over. So there's some healing possibility there, but something occasioned that situation of the being in there. And so from what I understand, you've been doing quite a bit, Bob, with working with people in this situation and trying to help. I don't know if unblend is the right word, but kind of detach. There's one episode that I mentioned in the book that really struck me in my editing, where Swedenborg said this group of spirits, they weren't very good spirits, came to him and they said to him, "We have always been with you." And Swedenborg said, "No, you just literally just got here." And it's very similar to some of the things that Bob writes about in his book, where they have thoughts about what they're doing there, but they're not necessarily accurate. And through some communication with them, you could say, you can head on to the light. Actually, this is not your home. You don't belong here, kind of thing. But
so that's one of the main similarities then between internal family systems therapy and the Swedenborgian work is the idea that of dialogue with these parts.
Super, super important idea. When I was being trained, if you were talking to someone who was hearing voices and you encouraged them to dialogue with those voices, you could lose your license. That was considered gross malpractice. You were colluding with the delusions of a psychotic, and it was big, big trouble. And I think it's the royal road to healing. And the errors that have been made in the name of healing are appalling and truly tragic. I wish I'd invented the phrase "the porous mind," but no, it's Charles Taylor, I think he's deceased, professor of philosophy from McGill University, and Tanya Luhrmann, who I think is the greatest living anthropologist, just a brilliant, brilliant person. She has used it a great deal in analyzing how psychosis and spirituality fit together in all these different cultures. And several of her articles, she says point blank, porosity of mind is the basis of religion. That's religion is about experience. It's not about a doctrine. And all of this depends on porosity of mind. And if the culture has a model of mind that more allows and recognizes porosity, they will have more profound personal religious experience. And it's not just a theory. She's studied this all over the world, with hard data.
I think an idea from Swedenborg that is an interesting one to bring up at this juncture about porosity is that one of the ways that Swedenborg describes our psyches, our souls, is that we are vessels. Like, our design is that we are a vessel. And you can think of that. You can read Swedenborg and think, okay, I, this singular thing, am a vessel for, and so Swedenborg says all of life is flowing into us. And even that all of our thoughts and all of our feelings are always flowing into us. It's always this interchange. So we're this vessel with these thoughts and feelings and influence from the divine flowing through. And so our identity is getting to choose what of that inflow we want to put our name on. Say, oh yeah, that is who I want to be. We get choice. That's the importance of our choice, is that we get to choose from this milieu of stuff that's coming through. Where do I want to identify myself with this? And so it's interesting when you bring that down to the level of parts, that individual parts are vessels, their own unique vessel that is experiencing an inflow of thoughts and feelings and an inflow from the divine, and then they get to choose. And going back even to your point about evil or burdens as it's described in IFS, like that phenomenon is us thinking we've started identifying with something that maybe isn't actually necessary for us to identify, or there was some reason why we took it on, believed it about ourselves, started to feel that we had to feel this shame because of this belief or whatever it is. And it has this stickiness to it. It stays around and it can start to drive your life. But this point of Swedenborg and IFS bringing out that you can have a dialogue. Your identity gets to interact with these parts or interact with this inflow and reflect on it and decide, do I want to hang on to this or not? Is this what I want to identify with or not? And that's what then ends up creating this freedom and healing. And we haven't brought up the subject or like the concept of self yet, or like this, the divine flowing into our inner self from Swedenborg's perspective. But that is this critical factor of what do we ultimately want to be choosing to identify with. Is you can identify with this divine love and divine wisdom that's flowing into your system. And yet even doing that doesn't take away the uniqueness of your vessel, like the you that you are is sustained in that and a critical part, just like each of the parts are in a system. I just find that concept of vessel a very perhaps different way of understanding what it means to be a human entity of consciousness and then interacting with, or how it makes sense to interact with this natural porosity. Because I think in my experiences, a lot of people think of spiritual experiences as being maybe spontaneous or it's a near-death experience that happens, or maybe plant medicine, or any of these ways where you get to have a spiritual experience. But Swedenborg is saying, no, that's the baseline. We are all, this spiritual reality is what we're constantly, if you're having a thought, if you're having a feeling, you're having a spiritual experience, and you get to be in relationship with this inflow that's going on. So it's a really different orientation to what consciousness is.
I gather that, though, in the world of psychotherapy, if you look at Freud and Jung and Skinner and other of the great pioneers in the fields of therapy, what you find is they're very nervous about anything that sounds too spiritual. They come up right to the edge and then they back away from it because I think they're afraid that the scientific community will think that they're crackpots if they go any further.
Definitely. And Richard Schwartz has had that issue. And when I became sort of the most prominent person who was working with unattached burdens, he didn't want me to write the book. He didn't want me teaching and talking about this. He's subsequently changed and says, yeah, it's important. You need to do it. But so he's had this issue. Carl Jung, who I believe was the most openly spiritual, he's still, the book of his visions, the Red Book, he didn't want published until 50 years after his death. And so, yeah, you're right. It's very, very hard to introduce spirituality into the world of psychotherapy. Tragically difficult. We heal from any profound trauma without a spiritual connection. It's like we're blocking out the very thing we need the most.
Yeah, that's what struck me so much about these conversations too, was that if you say, okay, you can heal from your trauma as long as you will swear on this sheet of paper that there's nothing beyond the material realm, that only drugs will fix you. It's a brain chemistry situation, or and then we'll do everything we can for you. And so, well, you've taken the thing off the table that would actually, do some good.
A quote in the book, I think you mentioned, Bob, we talk about the difference between a stumbling block and a stepping stone is your attitude toward it, I think is the quote. Okay. And I feel that way about spirituality. But I'm sure you can speak to this, Bob, in your own work with people that, honestly, a lot of people's parts have a lot of burdens around spirituality. And there's a lot of legacy burdens around religion and how it's been misused, and it can be the source of a lot of people's trauma. So it's very delicate territory to even introduce in a way for a person's system that feels safe and really is actually for themselves to just experience whatever feels true in their own inner world, rather than this sort of, if you just believed it this way, you'd really be better off. That's not the point. And so I think there is a kind of dance around this stumbling block and stepping stone of spirituality.
You've used the term burdens quite a bit now, and legacy burdens, and we haven't defined it. And I'm sure there are some viewers who are scratching their heads and trying to figure out what do you mean, burdens? The way you're using it, it sounds like the burden is a person.
Burdens are extreme emotions, beliefs, and other energy or gunk people took on when they were children being hurt. And they're not true, but like some little kid will get totally ashamed of their body because their mother yelled at them at a certain time. That shame would be a burden. And we help witness that part, how it got that burden on it, and then we help that part get that burden off. An unattached burden is something that's not from a person's personal lifetime, and sometimes there are legacy burdens that were passed down through the whole family. Like you had a whole family that were bigots and hated everybody who wasn't, just like you. So there are various kinds of burdens. And the idea is the parts aren't bad. They just carry really difficult burdens sometimes. I want to go back to something else if I could, Jonathan. Jeffrey, my experience of you is you have spent decades fighting this exact same prejudice we are talking about. The willful blindness and refusal to believe in these deeper realms. And I think you've done a great service, really important service. I keep trying to sneak spirit in. It's so bizarre that we have to do this. But I found a way. I think it's a really good way now, because I ask people, have you ever had a spiritual experience or a higher power or something like that? Nah, I don't do that garbage. And I say, have you ever seen or heard something so beautiful that it brought tears to your eyes? Almost everybody says yes. And I think for a lot of people, that might be how you get that door open just a crack to start.
Nice. And Wilson Van Dusen had what he called the gift of tears. Every time he got near certain topics, the tears would flow. That was very striking to me.
Well, it certainly reminds me of spirituality. I often talk about a life-changing experience I had. It was a dream in which my great-uncle Harry appeared. It turned out it was at the moment of his death, I later learned. And I woke up from that dream crying tears of joy. It's the only time that ever happened. And it seemed as if when you approach what I have to think of as the afterlife, or maybe in the case of my Uncle Harry, a heavenly realm, it's just so beautiful, it's beyond words. And tears of joy were the only, I shouldn't say only, because I was also singing a religious hymn can you imagine awakening from a dream, singing and crying at the same time? So that experience, which occurred over 50 years ago, was a turning point in my life.
That is so great to hear that, and very striking. Swedenborg wrote a journal he called a Journal of Dreams, where he's going through this transition, and he sings, doesn't he, Chelsea? You and I did a podcast about that at one point. It's just this kind of childhood hymn came back to him, and he's singing and weeping, and
at his most critical point. Yeah, it was like one of that deepest. There was nothing else he could do but sing this childhood hymn.
And as I say, I think it started to come to him in his dreams. That's where it started. That as he got older, he pushed back the date of when this transition happened, and I think it was because he started to include the fact that it actually happened in the dreams first, and then started to break out into his day-to-day life in a different way. Yes, and he had to make that choice that you're talking about. Like even worse back then. Now millions of people have had near-death experiences, and there's a lot of material on YouTube, or this sort of information is available. But back then, it was they had a belief in spirits, and there was certainly witchcraft, and these kind of concepts were around. But I think for a distinguished nobleman scientist to say he was having these experiences, it was there are stories at that time of people who would find out that Swedenborg was been invited to a dinner. Let's say you have 20 guests are going to be at dinner, and they would go in order to make fun of him because he was kind of a laughing stock. But when he started speaking, they just sat entranced and listened to him because it was amazing. His presence was amazing. They found they couldn't mock him the way they wanted to when they were with him in person. But yeah, I think it was a costly decision he made.
One of the things that was most delightful, I thought these conversations might be a little bit stuffy. Swedenborg, Latin translator. But we were so excited at the end of each 2 hour, or more or less 2 hours. We were just going, ooh, wait a minute. And my real hope was that in editing this book, if that excitement could come through, that was what I was hoping more than anything. Because just, that delight and excitement and worlds opening kind of feeling is so wonderful. I want to toss in one other subject as something we might talk about. I think it's a really original idea in Swedenborg. He says that when we die, there are heavens and hells that we could go to, but what we do is we go to whatever it is we truly loved in this lifetime. There's nobody up there with a whip saying you were bad, you go down there. You go to whatever, if you truly love power and fighting, you go to a place where it's all power and fighting. Now, if you truly love knowledge and learning, it made me go, what do I truly love? And how do I get clear and clean about this? So I think that's very unique.
A couple of thoughts on that. One is this emphasis that Swedenborg puts on the value of reflection, which there's so much deeper dimension to that when you think about parts and self, that we are a multiplicity, that we're naturally and inherently multiple. Like by design, we have different parts. Like our body is always the perfect example of that. I am this one thing, and yet I could talk about my hand in a very different way than I talk about my heart. I can feel how is my left leg doing compared to how is my right leg doing. We're used to living with multiplicity, and same with porosity. We're used to breathing in this air, and then it becomes us, and then we exhale something out into the world. It's all very evident. And so why would our inner experience be any different? But so that this power of reflecting on yourself, like I hear you, Bob, saying, oh, what do I love? Like that's this power of starting to reflect on yourself, that then you get to know what are those beliefs and feelings that our parts are holding. And then you get to go on that journey of discernment, which is what Swedenborg says. That's how we open ourselves up to heaven. He really just says that it's almost binary, where it's like you're either opening yourself up to heaven or closing yourself off from heaven. Like you're hardening yourself against the inflow of heaven, or you're softening and opening up to it. And so that's something that's another parallel between Swedenborg and IFS, is what in the IFS world, but beyond it too, they call that it's a constraint release model, that it's less about building up muscle over something and more about learning to soften and open and let go into something greater. And that's what lets us open up to that heavenly inflow. Like Bob, you were saying, I'm going to take that with me, of this asking somebody, when did you experience something that brought you to tears, through whether it was music or whatever the experience was? Because Swedenborg goes so far as to say the feeling of love that we have is the divine with us. That is what divine love is. And so if we're ever experiencing that, we're opening up to heaven. And I find that the most resistance that we have is just an unwillingness to even believe that it's possible, that we can actually turn inward and connect to a source of love that is really beyond us and yet cares about us. When we turn inside, that spiritual world is available to us. Swedenborg says our minds are in the spiritual world right now. It's not so much a transition the way that we think of it is after death, that like our minds are already there in the world of spirits.
This was just something that really struck me through our conversations, was that I had a couple of IFS sessions before we had our conversations, and then connected with an IFS therapist for a number of sessions afterwards, which was really delightful. And the amazing thing is that just by taking, it would start with a physical symptom, just become calm. What are you feeling in your body? And then you close your eyes and go into that feeling. And pretty soon this thing has a personality, and it's telling you things, and other people are objecting, and all it's going. And to realize that what Swedenborg would call another world, he says that is the world of, you're in the spiritual world. That's non-physical. And you can sort of tell just from the way that life and time works there, partly that the parts have no idea how old you are. They don't even know how old you are, and things like that. That's all that's necessary to step into that other world. Just close your eyes and you can spend 45 or 50 minutes there, and then come out and then get something for dinner, and and yet healing is happening. And so that's, to my mind, where the title of the book came from, and just an exciting aspect of these conversations to realize how close that is, how present and useful.
I thought one of the most fascinating aspects of your book was the section where you describe how Swedenborg would say, oh, this spirit showed up in my elbow or showed up in my knee. He would choose different parts of his body where the spirits were residing. And just now, Jonathan, you're describing a similar process in psychotherapy where you start with a felt sense of something in the body, and what emerges is it has a voice, it has a personality.
That's right. And what I love about it, I've had lots of other kinds of therapy in the past, including cognitive behavioral therapy and other forms. And they would always seem to start from thought. What am I thinking? And then I'll tell the therapist what I'm thinking. And by going through the body, it just circumvents that whole, because it's a mystery to me. I don't know what's going on, and I hadn't noticed it before I was asked the question, but actually, I have this tiredness over the lids of my eyes, or my left shoulder is feeling that, whatever it is. And then off you go. And I love that point, Jeffrey, that because that's a strikingly odd thing about Swedenborg's works when you read them, that it never sort of tells you what the map is. He just says above the kidneys or below the left foot or something like that. And yet, it does seem that he was mapping, that he was experiencing it through his own body. And so that was his point of reference. And he says that the human form, not the physical shape, but more the function, the way that consciousness is also attached to these organs and systems and so on, is characteristic of the whole universe. It's a characteristic of heaven. It's a characteristic of God, and so we're wearing the map. There was this show years ago called Prison Break, where somebody went into prison to rescue his brother, and in order to find his way through this very complicated prison, he had the whole shape of the prison tattooed onto his body and then grew his hair or whatever it was. But he was literally wearing the map. Well, we're all wearing the map. We've got the map on us.
You can imagine when I mentioned at the beginning that I found the IFS model very intuitive from a Swedenborg standpoint. That is one of the key things, was where else, after spending decades reading Swedenborg, talking about the spirits that flew into my liver and had this kind of a quality to them, and then the spirits of my hip and my ears, and this very specific body connected orientation, like Jonathan's saying. And then that's one of the key questions in IFS is you say, where are you experiencing that in or around your body? Because Swedenborg also will say, well, it was over my left shoulder. It's not always inside his body, it's in and around. And I was like, wow, a whole modality is using this therapeutically to pay attention to where you're experiencing something in or around your body. And I think part of the value of that, to my mind, is, again, it brings you into relationship right away. And relationship is that's critical to what's healing. And so suddenly there's a dimension. At first, you're just thinking, oh, I'm so anxious. I just can't think about what's going to happen when X, Y, and Z goes on. And then you're like, where am I experiencing that anxiety in or around my body? Oh, it's actually this tightness in my upper belly, right below my diaphragm. And so suddenly you can relate to it. And then that deepens and deepens in the way that it brings you into the inner world, and you're getting to open up to self, what IFS calls self energy. And I wonder if that's what was going on for Swedenborg too, because he was really understanding, okay, all these spirits are flowing into me all the time, but it helps him know who's where and what's going on, because he can be in relationship to it. If it's, oh yeah, those ones that make my elbow hurt. Yeah, that's.
And it's interesting, it's striking me right now that he felt it important to record which body part, even though he must have known that his readers would be baffled by what he was saying. What? And yet, thank heavens he did, because, there was a truth to it, and that's part of the communication.
I noticed in your book there was some discussion about the symbolic interpretation of the different body parts. What can we draw from if the spirit lands on your liver? Is that a little different than if it lands on your elbow, and so on? But it wasn't clear to me whether that was a Swedenborgian idea or whether it was a more modern attempt to look at it. I do know that Swedenborg's interpretations of the Bible rely pretty heavily on symbolic interpretations.
That's right. And he does get into, he goes pretty deeply into the different organ systems, the kidneys as opposed to the heart and the lungs and the organs of generation and so on. And says what kinds of beings are associated. There was one description I love, just for a little example, that he said he was talking to a spirit who, in order to do that spirit, the job that they had was to receive kind of input and then just decide whether to pass it on or not pass it on, kind of like a synapse. He said they do this in such a deep state that it's like being asleep. He actually thought the spirit was asleep, but just in a very deep state of sleep, they just say yes and pass it on, or no. And he said they correspond to the gap between the two halves of the brain, where there's this kind of riot going on in the two sides of the brain, but there's this peacefulness in the center that just goes, should I pass this over to the other side, or should I just leave the drama on this side of the brain? And I don't know, I found that very evocative and fascinating. So he does. But I don't know if our IFS practitioners on the call have anything further to add about how that information is stored. A lot of it is what the client, the person going through the session, associates with it. Is that right? It's not something you would impose, obviously.
First, I want to say his idea that there's some very sleepy, I would read that as unconscious part that determines what gets through and what doesn't. That sounds exactly like predictive processing or predictive coding, which is one of the cutting edge theories of perception that's only emerged in the past decade. Once again, he was a few hundred years ahead of his time. Yeah, I make it a big point not to follow any of those, recipe books of like, if it's the left elbow, it means this. I find those do more damage than good, and you just have to ask. There's a motto that I used to train IFS, people who are learning IFS in: don't think, just ask. When you have this brilliant theory with all sorts of footnotes about what that means, put that aside. Have the fundamental human respect to ask, what does that mean to you? And that's so unsatisfying for so many people.
Yeah, I think one of the points we make in the book is that it just signals that there's so much depth. Swedenborg spent his whole life, he was noticing what the spirits of his right eye are like compared to the spirits of his left eye. And all of it, like I mentioned, the vesselness of us, what we're vessels of is this primary spiritual substance, what Swedenborg says is spiritual substance, that is love and wisdom. And so all the different parts of us are unique vessels of love and wisdom. And so the way that the right eye interacts with spiritual substance and conveys something is very distinct than the left eye. And is it more love oriented or more wisdom oriented? And even that is, Swedenborg says that love and wisdom are distinguishably one, which means that in essence, they're one thing, but we can experience it as wisdom or as love. But there's this eternal relationship between these two things that are essentially actually united. You can study Swedenborg and categorize, okay, what does the stomach correspond to? What does the heart correspond to? And the lungs? Take it up, play with it, see how that feeds you in your own experience of your own body, to reflect on it that way without a kind of rigidity. It doesn't have to be, it's more an invitation to understand that your lungs are symbolic of some relationship with love and wisdom that is in relationship with your heart. And so how does that work? And so then when you're getting to know a part and it's connected with a certain part of your body, there's just so much information you can bring curiosity to about that part and its experience in your body. And I will say, hearing myself talking about the heart and lungs, like that's one of these things. Swedenborg does talk about the heart as being this domain of love and the lungs being like wisdom. So he does make these sort of large categorical differentiations that we all have a heart and lungs. So it's that same paradox of we all have a human body, and yet we're all entirely distinct and unique down to our fingerprints. And so you always have to be holding it lightly to make a kind of generalization. And I just see that as more of, like I said, an invitation to explore the depth of that in your own experience and in your relationship with your parts. And what Jonathan was saying, Swedenborg says our whole body is a map of heaven. So it's fun from a contemplative standpoint. I wrote one time, I think for Off the Left Eye, was using that as a meditation, as like a springboard of what Swedenborg says the different parts of your body correspond to. And so as you're focusing your attention on your heart, to be bringing to mind, these qualities that Swedenborg says of heaven, the societies of heaven that connect with your heart, and the communities of heaven that connect to all the different parts of your body.
IFS is a form of psychotherapy, and in that sense, it's very structured. For one thing, you're always with a therapist, I presume. It's a therapy session. And now you've referred to within the Swedenborg world a meditation, which is, an exercise a person can do all by themselves if they wish. Are there other practices within the Swedenborg world that would be more structured in addition to meditation?
I would say that it's even though it's been around for hundreds of years now, it's because the community of people until recently that's been aware of these works has been so small, there isn't much in the way of traditions or modalities. But I constantly think, as I'm working with Swedenborg's works, translating or editing, that there is a world here. Some of the passages we get into in the book, you can just dive into one paragraph and do so much with it. And I think the work we mentioned before, Jerry Marzinski, the work that he's done with psychotics, with people in very dangerous conditions in emergency rooms and so on, is amazing. Just taking certain principles and applying them. So I think there's almost an unlimited number of modalities and practices that could come out of this. And part of what made this such an exciting conversation is, for one thing, Bob is so knowledgeable about all these. He was encyclopedic about here's this author and their book and this and that, and bringing all this in. It made me feel like I occupy this very narrow. I've just looked at one person for 40 years or something, but it made it a very rich conversation, and I do hope it spurs other conversations like this, because I think putting these, for an analogy, the richest areas in nature, I think, are where two different systems meet, right? Like where the ocean meets the land. And so I think there's something very rich about finding this point of intersection like this.
I was going to say something similar. I love the idea of Swedenborg, and even when I mentioned meditation, it's like there's many traditions of meditation, but then if you incorporate some ideas from Swedenborg, you get a whole new bouquet of potential opportunities there. And I think the same thing can be said for yoga. Like you can be practicing yoga and then layer on Swedenborg into that, and the correspondences, the symbolism of the body into that kind of a practice. And same with breathing exercises. And again, like therapeutic modalities, connecting Swedenborg there. I love that Swedenborg, and that's where it seems like there is a lot of power and potential rather than a Swedenborg only praxis.
And if Suzuki comes back to mind again, which was a putting together and showing Swedenborg's influence or similarities in a very different arena. He's from Northwestern Europe, and you're talking about its effect across the other side of the planet.
I want to come back to your question, Jeffrey. First of all, you can do IFS on your own. There's a whole book about it by Jay Early called Self-Therapy. It's using IFS to work alone. Most people, I work with my parts every day on my own. And there's a great deal you can do on your own. So it's not always with a therapist. Thinking of the Buddhist thing, there's a very famous article in the IFS world by a Buddhist scholar named Jack Engler, where he says the IFS idea of self is exactly the same as the Buddhist concept of no self. And we have a language problem here. We have a serious language problem here. And I think most of, like what all these people who talk about ego and hate the ego, and if they think you're being a jerk, they say you're being egoic. Well, in IFS, we view that as the group of managers, these protective parts who normally are driving your bus. And we don't We don't hate them or make them bad, but we know we want to get to this place of self instead. And I think, now I'd like Jonathan and Chelsea to talk about this. The equivalent of this IFS concept of self, which is Buddhist no self, would be this influx in Swedenborg. Is that right?
Like an inflow of divine love and wisdom into what Swedenborg calls your inner self. And there's different ways, again, like Jonathan can speak to, where Swedenborg is not a, what's the word, absolutist, I think, in his terms. You can't create a simple glossary of this means that, because he uses it in this way a lot of the time, but then other places he seems to mean this. There's a quote where he says, the inner self is the Lord, and that's his term for the divine. So there's this quality of your inner self can be so open that it's just this receiving this direct inflow from the divine of love and wisdom, that spiritual substance. But then he also very much talks about your inner self being, it's a part of the vessel that you are. So there is this distinction between the inflow and your inner self. So there's a lot he explores around, I think he even says most people aren't conscious of their inner self. Like he talks about how our mind is mapped onto these levels of heaven, and that you can open up to these inner levels of heaven in your mind right now. But so that's the most parallel with self, no self, is this inflow of the divine into your inner self, that then I think your inner self, if it's opened up to that inflow, operates as that capital S self in IFS.
Yes, I noticed that you capitalize the word self when you're referring to the IFS use of the term, and I presume that meant if Swedenborg used the term, you didn't capitalize it.
For anybody coming from a Swedenborgian tradition, the idea of self is very much aligned with evil, that it is this corrupted thing inside of us. So it's definitely an interesting play on words. We introduce this Latin word, proprium, in the book, that is your sense of self, that this selfhood. But then Swedenborg talks about how the self can be brought to life, like that proprium gets renewed or becomes open to heaven.
Yeah, it was very interesting to me, and from what I understand, I think it was Dick Schwartz who said let's call it self, and with a capital S, and the qualities that are associated with it, the 8 C's, and particularly I think of compassion and curiosity, but there are others as well, really does sound like a characteristic that Swedenborg would say are divine. And the way that in a session, apparently, certainly in my experience, but I also in things that I've read, you don't see, when you're in self, you don't see yourself. It's just a perspective. So it's almost like consciousness itself. And if you find yourself in another part, a manager or something, that's a different experience than being in the self. And I was very struck by Bob had mentioned to us, and I think it's in the book, that Dick Schwartz had come to the point of thinking that maybe there was only one self, because the characteristics are in common with everybody. And so I came away from our sessions thinking about it, our conversations for the book, thinking of it as that point where the divine enters us, so it has these divine qualities. And Swedenborg talks a lot about the Lord in us. Another thing that came up in our sessions was the idea, and Swedenborg talks about this too, that there's a part of you that is beyond. It cannot be stained. It can't be corrupted. It's untouchable. Whatever you've been through, whatever you did to somebody else, whatever somebody else did to you, can't be compromised. It's pure, and it's that point where you receive that divine life in the way that Chelsea was talking about with the vesselhood. And so I think, I don't know, but I think there's something about those divine qualities coming down in that. And again, how amazing to say, oh, you could close your eyes and you could be in the spiritual world without realizing you're having a spiritual experience. And how amazing to think that by coming into self, and one of the things that Bob trains people to do is to know, not only be in self, but know, how to recognize that you're in that state where that's active. And if you slip out of it in a session, ask for a second and get reoriented and try to get back into it. Well, how beautiful a thought that really has divine qualities, because one of the things that Bob got across and is in the book is that the healing relationship is not some transference with the therapist. The healing relationship is the self to the parts. That's where the healing takes place. And so for the self to move in, when these managers have been running everything, but they're exhausted, and then other parts are exiled and causing trouble from the sides, and there's kind of general chaos in the kingdom, for the self to come in and go, okay, I recognize you, I love you, you're fine. How about you listen a little more to this one, and so on. It does change, and just one session can have this lasting change. I think there's something divine. So some of what Swedenborg says about the divine or the Lord in us kind of language relates to that presence of self with a capital S. And Swedenborg even gets into the idea, as Chelsea mentioned, that we all get our self from the divine. God has selfhood or something. So there is a divine version as well as the kind of corrupt version that we have. And mainly what I think Swedenborg means by that corruption is that if you believe you are an autonomous being separate from all other beings, and that your thoughts are entirely your own, your feelings are all your own, that's the source of a lot of the trouble that happens in the world. And if we could get over that and realize we're part of this larger thing, some of the mayhem would go away.
That idea of Swedenborg's, that this divine self, who we really are, is inviolable, can't even be dirtied. That's exactly the same thing Dick Schwartz says about self in IFS. And for me, as a survivor of major trauma, that was a revolutionary message. Every other therapist had told me, you're damaged, you'll never be okay, take some meds, expect a miserable little life. You didn't get the early attachment, you got all this trauma, too bad. And so Dick comes along and says, no, the core of who you really are can't be damaged, it can't even be dirtied. It's like the sun after a storm, the clouds part, and that sun is who you are. That was a life-saving message for me. And for many other people I worked with, people with major, major trauma, who'd been told their whole lives, you can't get over that. And it's just, it still makes me want to cry, that's, and that message was around, 250 years ago, and we still are ignoring it.
Well, that's a very important point of contact between these two traditions. It seems to me the notion of either self or the divine. I think Carl Jung said when he referred to self, he meant it's the part of us that is closest to the divine.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, this has been a delightful conversation. It's very exciting to see these two traditions coming together and learning from each other. And I'm very happy to be able to share your conversation with the New Thinking Aloud audience. And I know that both IFS and the Swedenborgian world have a lot to contribute to culture on earth at large. So it's a real pleasure for me to be with all of you. And I want to thank you very much for the work that you've done together to have this dialogue and then record it in your book, and to reach out to me, to reach out to our viewers.
Thank you, Jeffrey, and thank you for everything you're doing and have done. You're a great asset to the world.
Yeah, this has been such an honor and a pleasure to get to be in conversation with you and to get to share this book and even to have gotten to create this book with Bob and Jonathan. Like, I really hope that it's a gift to people. And I think you'll find part of the design was having it remain a conversational format, because these ideas can be a little bit heady or can feel so abstract, or what are you talking about? And so it brings it down to this very accessible level to have just Bob and Jonathan and I tossing these ideas back and forth, but then it's been carefully edited and organized topically. So I really hope it does help people, inspire people, and we'd love to hear about it too, if it does.
We'll have contact information for you, your websites in the description of the video. So I do hope that listeners and viewers and readers reach out to you to keep the dialogue going. Well, thank you all for being with me. And for those of you watching or listening, thank you for being with us, because you are the reason that we are here.
Book 3 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu. You can now download all 8 copies of the New Thinking Aloud magazine for free, or order beautiful printed copies. Go to newthinkingaloud.org.